All right, welcome to lesson number 3, Dealing with Wind in Flight Simulator 2020. So wind is a complicated subject. There is a lot of little intricacies that go into it. This video is going to be an introductory video to dealing with wind so that you can understand the basics and get flying. But we'll actually have a few more videos in the future about wind as well. Just it'll go into a little bit more detail as to how the different how you can basically fly the plane based on how much wind there is. So we care about wind for a few reasons. Obviously, anyone who's been on a commercial flight has probably already been on a fairly bumpy flight, which isn't pleasant. But that's actually one of the last things we care about in terms of the bumpiness. What you're really concerned about is how you're actually going to get from point A to point B when the wind is blowing, because it does affect how you fly, and it also affects how you take off, and it affects how you land. So we're going to look at all of those together and see how we fly into the wind in this flight. So let's say you were in your airplane and you wanted to fly from point A to point B, and that between point A and point B you had to fly a heading of 320. So that would be the course that you have to fly from point A to point B. Now, if there's no wind and the winds are calm, basically what you would end up doing is you would take off and you would fly that heading 320, and eventually you would end up where you wanted. Now, reality is there's always going to be some wind. There's might be very little wind, but there'll always be a little bit of wind that you have to compensate for. And some days there'll be a lot of wind that you have to compensate for. And that's when you have to know the difference between your heading and your track. So in the picture that we see there, the wind is blowing from right to left. Our airplane is just taking off from that runway right there on a heading 320, and it's flying a heading of 320 when it immediately takes off. Now, if you were to hold that heading of 320, what you would end up actually doing is you would end up flying a course that's something more like 315 or something, which is that second arrow on the left, the track. So basically the track is the actual path that your plane is flying over the ground, which is going to be different from the actual heading that's indicated on the heading indicator. So that's the first way that wind is going to affect the way you fly from point A to point B. The next way that it's going to impact you is the actual speed your plane is traveling at. So let's say you're in the air and you're traveling at 100 knots. Are you actually traveling at 100 knots? Well, again, it depends on the wind. If you have a wind that's coming from behind, which is the picture that you see on the left, your airspeed's actually still going to be 100 knots, but your ground speed is actually going to be higher. So what happens is the airspeed indicator is going to show 100 knots, but you've got a 20 knot tailwind behind you. Your speed relative to the ground is actually going to be higher than 100 knots. It's going to be the sum of those two. So it'll be 120 knots rather than 100 knots. The opposite is also true. So if you're flying again at 100 knots on the right hand side, but there's a headwind, you're flying straight into the wind, your ground speed's actually going to be much lower. It'll be 80 knots on the ground. And if you think back to some of the flights you've probably taken over the years, sometimes flights have taken maybe shorter or longer time depending on how much wind there was, and this is the reason behind it, basically. So now that we know how the wind is going to affect us when we're flying, let's have a look at how we would actually fly around our traffic pattern, which we were practicing in the previous lesson. So again, the wind is blowing from right to left, and we are going to be doing a left-hand traffic pattern. So when you're getting ready to take off, you're going to apply full power just as usual, and what's going to end up happening is the plane's actually going to start veering to the right, because the wind is going to be blowing from right to left, and you're going to have to apply rudder, basically to the rudder by twisting the joystick to keep you on the center line of the runway. Once you've rotated, which in the Cub, which we'll be using, is at around 60 kilometers an hour from what I remember, at that point you pull back on the stick And once you're established in a positive rate of climb, what you're going to do is something called crabbing. What you're going to do is you're going to actually turn your nose off to the right, so into the wind, just the slightest amount, basically so that you maintain that runway heading as you are taking off. So in this case, you would probably maybe turn 3 degrees to the right to around 323 or 324 or so. You'll have to play with it depending on how much wind you actually set up coming in the crosswind. So once you've taken off, you've done that upwind leg, and you're getting ready to turn onto the crosswind leg. As you're turning onto that crosswind leg, remember the wind is coming at you from the right of the plane, so it's going to be pushing you off to the left already. So when you do make that turn, you're going to want to use a little bit more bank angle to make that turn a little bit faster, because the wind is going to start pushing you from behind, which means you're going to travel over the ground much faster, which means you have to turn a little bit faster, basically to compensate for the wind. So that first turn and second turn onto downwind of the traffic pattern, you're going to want to have a bank angle of probably around 30 degrees, which is probably about the maximum you would want to do in the Cub anyways. And yeah, so basically you'll turn 30 degrees of bank onto the downwind leg. And again, once you're on the downwind leg, so on your way, when you're parallel to the runway, what you're going to want to do is crab into the wind again, but it's going to be the opposite direction now. So you'll have to crab left about 3 or 4 degrees because the wind's going to be coming from the opposite direction now that you're heading down in the other direction. The opposite is also true once you're going to get to turn onto your base and your final turn. In this case, the wind is going to be coming at you as you're making those turns. So because of that, you're actually, as we saw in the last slide, you're going to be traveling slower over the ground. So you're actually going to want to make those turns a little bit slower with a little less bank angle, just because it's going to take you less time basically to do those turns, because you're going to be moving slower relative to the ground. Now, once you get on to final, that's where you have to combine two different concepts in order to get down safely onto the ground. So what I like to do is I like to establish myself on the final approach, put myself into a crab, and hold that crab until I'm at around 200 or so feet off the ground. And at that point, what I'm going to do is something called a side slip. Which we're going to have a look at on the next slide. So you can see it here, what that looks like. So a side slip basically means that you are coming down towards the ground, but your nose is actually pointed right down the runway, so you're not crabbing anymore. You can see it in this picture. I have my nose pointed right down the runway. I'm not off to 3 or 4 degrees anymore. So what you end up doing is you end up applying a little bit of the ailerons to bank the wings into the wind. So your wings are slightly banked, as you can see on that picture. And what you're going to do is you're going to use the opposite rudder direction to keep your nose pointed down the center of the runway. And in that way, you're basically going to send in a slip, in the sense that your plane is sort of banked, but hold it going down straight towards the runway. Because you're combining the rudder action with the aileron action. Now, some of these maneuvers are a little hard to do with just a joystick. You really have to get used to the twisting motion. It's not super obvious at first when you first try it, so don't worry about it, and you'll see when we get into the simulator in a couple seconds. Even I have a tendency to screw it up fairly frequently. It's really hard with the joystick, but you do get used to it just like anything else. The other thing to keep in mind is that the rudder in Flight Simulator right now is a little bit iffy. I did do a bit of research on this before recording. It seems that even if you've got the realism settings on maximum, that the rudder is basically always adjusting itself automatically. So you can still do the side slip like I just described, and it will work perfectly fine. But in all other situations, when you're actually flying around, you don't need to use the rudder for anything, because it seems like the simulator is doing it for you. There's been a lot of discussion about this on forums about it. For now, as of the time of recording this video anyways, For anything other than a slide slip or when you're on the ground, even if you have that setting for auto rudder turned off, you still don't really need the rudder. So hopefully they're going to address that in the near future. All right, so there's a bunch more things we could have spoken about in terms of wind, like I said earlier. For example, we could have talked about coordinated, uncoordinated flight when it comes to the side slip and when it comes to turning your plane. We could have talked about maximum crosswinds that you can safely operate at for takeoff and landing. And we could have looked at a few other little things somewhat related, but we'll keep that for another lesson in the future, and we're going to jump into the simulator and basically just practice basically everything we just went over. So we're going to be looking at dealing with crosswinds, we're going to be looking at doing our traffic pattern with the crosswind, and coming in for a landing. So let's get to it. Okay, so here we are back in the game. We're going to go to the world map just as usual, and we are going to select our departure airport, which as usual, if you've been watching previous videos here, I'm just using the Gold Coast Airport on the east coast of Australia. Main reason I'm using that airport is because it's right next to the water, and it's fairly easy to find, very hard to get lost, so it just makes everything a little bit easier. And I'll just choose that as an arrival airport as well. And now we're going to go into flight conditions. As usual, I will leave multiplayer off and I'll leave air traffic off just to keep things as simple as possible just for my demo flight, but feel free to use live traffic, live players if you want to make your flight a little bit more realistic when you're doing this practice. The important part for this flight is the weather and time, which is here. So you want to click into custom, and when you come in, it's going to probably be set to clear skies. So what you can do is this little window here basically allows you to control everything related to weather and wind and time. So I'm just going to set myself to daytime. Here we go. And what I am going to do is for this flight, we are going to add a crosswind layer, a wind layer that's going to be going from right to left across the runway. The runway that we are going to set for takeoff is runway 32. And what we're going to do in the flight conditions is we're going to add a wind layer, we'll say up to about 10,000 feet. So all you do is you just drag this little wind indicator up to wherever you want that wind layer, and then you can just set your settings right here. So I'm going to set it to blow from around, we'll say around 0.43 degrees, sounds about right. It'll be basically effectively perpendicular to our runway, which is exactly what we're looking for. I'll set the same thing for the gusts, and we'll use a crosswind of about 8 knots for this flight. Just to start off simple. If it's the first time you're going to be playing with wind, I would probably go even a little lower than 8, something like 5 to 7 if you want. It'll just make it that a little bit easier for your first flights in the wind, because it can be a bit jarring the first time you go up and there's a lot of wind. I remember I was very dismayed at how the plane handled it completely differently. So if you wanted to add another wind layer, if we were going to be going above 10,000 feet, you would simply click here and add another wind layer. But for our purposes, we're just going to be staying at the pattern altitude, which is 1,000 feet, so that should be fine. What I would recommend is saving this configuration here. If you're going to be coming back to play it later, if you're going to want to practice your crosswind landings again, you can actually save that weather configuration by clicking this little save button here, and you can just give it a name. And I will call it Clear Skies Crosswind, and just hit save. So now my flight conditions are set, and I've got my preset here. So the next time I want to fly this flight, all I've got to do is click Clear Skies Crosswind, and it just loads up my settings for me. Alright, and with all of that set, we are pretty much ready to fly. Alright, so here we are back in the sim, and we've got everything loaded up and ready. So I'm just going to quickly get us into position at the end of the runway there and basically go over what's going to happen as we take off, because things do tend to happen fairly quickly when you've got the wind blowing. So the first thing that we have to be aware of when we're taking off is you can sort of already see it now that the wind is pushing the plane a little bit off its course. I'm adjusting that with the rudder. As you can see, I can move a little bit more to the left or a little bit more to the right, which is actually moving the tail wheel as well, and basically keeping me centered on the runway. So as we apply full power, that effect is actually going to happen a lot more, and you're going to actually see the plane start pulling very quickly to the right. So to compensate for that, I'll be applying opposite rudder. So I'll be twisting the joystick to the left, basically to keep myself basically on the runway center line. Once we reach takeoff speed at around 70 kilometers an hour, or about 40 knots, I will pull back on the stick, and as soon as we've established our positive rate of climb, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn 3 or 4 degrees to the right, basically to get in that crab position that we were talking about in the theory section. So my heading will be around 324, 325, and then we'll be able to see that we're actually following the runway center line as we move forward. And lastly, just before we head off, I like to actually make sure that everything's been configured properly. With the wind, I have had a few bugs here and there where the wind doesn't actually follow through to the game, so I just double check it before I take off. In this case, it's all good. And if ever you have a problem where your wind data isn't loaded, remember that we save the preset right here, so you could just select that really quickly and you would be all set. Okay, all that's done, so we are pretty much ready for takeoff. So I'm just going to apply full power. Tail's going to come up fairly quickly, and you can see right there the wind's trying to pull me off to the right. I'm going to rotate. Right, I got my positive rate of climb, and I'm just going to give myself just that wee little bit of crab angle right there. Alright. I'm dropping the power ever so slightly to around 4,500 RPM for our climb out to pattern altitude. And if we go to top-down view, we can see we're pretty much over the runway there. And we seem to be maintaining it, although I think we're drifting a little bit to the right, but I think for now it's quite alright. Alright, so I've got my power set. We're continuing to climb to the pattern altitude, just making sure we're staying on that runway heading. And as you can see, our actual heading in the top left is 325, which is maintaining about a 320 heading that we want to be in. Alright, we're coming up on pattern altitude now, so I'll reduce power even more so that we can level off. And now that we are past the runway, we can turn to the crosswind leg. Now remember, the wind is blowing from right to left across the screen, so I'm going to actually do this turn with a fair amount of bank, because the wind is going to start pushing me towards that left-hand direction, and I want to make sure to not overshoot what we're actually trying to accomplish here. So luckily in this case the wind is going to be blowing almost exactly behind me, so I'm just going to go to the runway heading that will be perpendicular to the runway, which is in this case 230. And now I'm actually going to start my downwind turn earlier than usual, again because the wind is pushing me, so I want to make sure that we don't get blown away too far from the runway. And again, I'm using a fair amount of bank to make sure that we don't get blown off, because now the wind is blowing us from left to right. Alright, there we go. So we've rolled out about a 140. And if we have a look, we're pretty much parallel to the runway, just about the right distance. So you can actually see the wind is blowing me a little bit left to right, so I'm going to crab in the opposite direction this time. Like that. That should do it right there. Okie dokie, so pretty soon it's going to be time to get set up for our base turn. So I'm just reducing power to around 3500 RPM for the cruise. And once we go past the edge of the runway, we're going to start setting up. So our airspeed is a little bit high right now. I will add a little bit of trim so I don't have to keep back pressure on the stick as I reduce power and reduce airspeed. There we go. Our heading is a little bit off right now, so I will adjust that just wheels a little bit. So we were a little bit too crabbed into the wind right there. That's a bit better like that. I'm not a big fan of the compass in this plane. Once we move to the 152 for our next flights, you'll see it's a little bit easier to read and use from the internal view than the external view. So our airspeed there is good. We're just about ready to turn base, and I'm going to reduce power just a little bit more, around 3000 RPM, and we're going to start our base turn. Now this turn, I can actually do it with less of a bank angle, and the reason for that is the wind is actually going to be coming right at us instead of from the left. So I'm making that turn at a very minimal amount of bank, and I'll just keep turning until we're perpendicular to the runway. Just keeping an eye on that airspeed, keeping an eye on the heading. That looks pretty good. So I think around 3000 RPM should be pretty good for our final turn, which will be coming up soon. Right, we can start around now. So the runway is there. I really, again, don't need a huge amount of bank to make that final turn, because again, we have the wind, we have the headwind, which is slowing us down over the ground. Shot it a little bit there. Just adjust that. Alrighty. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to descend in the crab position once I'm lined up with the runway until around 100 or 200 feet from the ground, at which point I will move to the external camera and try and do the side slip down to the runway. I won't land on this approach, I will just come in and then take off again. So you can see here from the external view, it's a little bit easier to visualize. I'm still in the crab position there. We're just descending towards the runway, and now once we get to around 200 feet, I'm going to let the wings come straight like that. Give myself a little bit of bank, and there we go. I'm in the crab position now, descending down to the runway, nice and slowly. So you hold those wings like that with the ailerons, and you use opposite rudder to just keep the nose of the plane pointed towards the runway. So ailerons to the right and rudder to maintain that runway heading. Alright, and if we wanted to, we could just land just like that. But in this case, what I will do is I'll actually just reapply full power, so we take off. And we'll go around and do it one more time. And we'll come in for the full stop. Alright, so we're reestablished on our departure. I'll reduce power a little bit now, 4,500 RPM, to get a nice climb speed. Just I'm a little bit off the runway center line here. Just fix that. I don't need a huge change to come back to the runway center line, because don't forget we have the wind blowing us, and you can actually see when I'm on that 320 heading, I'm going to be flying past the runway there from that above view. So now turn this to 324. Just like that. And again, we're going to be coming up on the pattern altitude, at which point we'll reduce power to around 3,500 RPM. Let's just see if we go past the runway. Alright, we've gone past the runway now, so again, we're going to turn left. With the wind at our backs, we're going to have a tailwind now, and I'm also going to reduce and eliminate our climb and reduce power. Just like that. Alrighty. So we hold our pattern altitude with around 3,500 RPM. And again, I'm going to turn final quicker, I will turn downwind a little faster and a little steeper than I normally would, because the wind is at our back, which means it's going to be pushing us further and further down the heading that we're heading. Just line into the runway there. Alrighty. So there we go. So this time we're going to actually come in for a final landing. That first one went fairly well, I think. Airspeed was good. The descent rate was pretty good. We were a little high, but I think that's all right. It's always better to be a little high, especially when you're starting out. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to go past the runway, and we are going to hold our crab down to around 200 feet, at which point we will switch to the side slip. So when you're switching to the side slip, it's fairly easy. You let the nose center out with the middle of the runway, and once the nose is centered with the runway, you apply some right aileron, so you push the joystick to the right, and you also use the rudder, you twist the rudder in the opposite direction, which allows you to basically fly the plane straight ahead and not get blown off by the wind. And it really seems like the best amount of power for landing is around 2,700 RPM. It gives you a nice steady descent, and it lets you basically focus on everything else, and you don't have to worry that your speed's going to get too low. Okie dokie, we're pretty much ready to turn on our base turn, so I'm going to turn with a little bit less bank than usual this time, because as we've said before, the wind's going to be blowing from the front of the plane towards the back, which means our actual ground speed is going to be a lot slower. Since we've got a 7-knot headwind, once we've turned to our heading of 040, basically we're going to be traveling around 7 knots slower than we would be otherwise. There we go. Alright. I probably should have started my descent a little bit earlier, but we will deal with it. Alright, we can turn final now. Again, don't need too much of a bank angle, just because the wind is coming straight at us, which is slowing the plane down. But if you see you've overshot, like I have now twice, use just that wee bit more bank angle. Right. So I'm just going to reduce power just that wee bit more, because we did start our descent a little late. Line us up with the runway there. Okey-dokey. So that's about a nice rate of descent. I'm trying to keep those two lines in the runway, those two big white blocks, at the same spot in my windshield. Once I get to around 200 feet, again, I will go to the external view, just to make it a little bit easier to do the slipstream. Side slip, sorry. Alright, there we go. So now, our airspeed is nice and steady. We're lined up with the runway. I'm going to use some aileron bank, and I will use the rudder to fly straight ahead. So I'm applying right force on the joystick, and I'm using the rudder to keep the nose centered down the runway center line. You can see the plane is just slowly slowing down. Reduce power just that wee bit more. And there we go, we're just coming down now. Let that plane slow down a wee bit more. And there we go. Alright, so that is it. So we did 2 circuits of the traffic pattern. Both times we had to crab into the wind, we had to adjust for the wind on every single leg of the pattern, including final. We crabbed down to around 200 feet, and at that point we switched to the side slip to make sure that we got down safely. And now we're just going to taxi off the runway, and this is the point where I'll thank you for watching again, and I'll hopefully see you next week around the same time.